Arizona Territory. Autumn 1878. Inside a sandstone cave deep in the desert dark, a small fire throws red light across the canyon walls. Outside rain hammers down, and floodwater tears through the canyon below like something alive and furious. Eva is shaking. Her clothes are soaked through, plastered cold against her skin. Her fingers find the first button and stop. She looks straight at Jesse, lip caught between her teeth, voice breaking on the one question she's been afraid to ask her entire life. What happens after I undress? Jesse doesn't say a word. He reaches into his coat, pulls out a folding knife, and places it in her hand, handle first. Then he strips off the only dry coat he has and drapes it over her shoulders. Turns his back completely, sits down at the cave mouth with his rifle across his knees, eyes on the storm and the raging flood below. He never looks back. Eva stands there, the knife solid in her palm, tears she hasn't decided to cry yet, burning at the edges. And for the first time in her life, she understands the difference between a man who takes and a man who protects. This is the story of a woman who ran from Missouri, a cowboy with blood on his hands, and a desert spring worth dying for. Follow along right now. You don't want to miss where this goes. The sun was dying. It bled out slow over the sandstone messes, painting the whole Arizona sky the color of a fresh wound. Red, orange, the kind of orange that doesn't look real until you're standing under it with dust in your teeth and nowhere left to go. Evangeline Thorne had plenty of dust in her teeth. The stagecoach shuddered to a stop, and she climbed down before the driver even set the brake. Her trunk followed with a heavy thud into the red dirt. She didn't wait for help. She'd stopped waiting for help somewhere around the Kansas border. Whispering Pines way station. The driver called down, already eyeing the horizon like he wanted to be somewhere else before dark. End of the line, miss. She looked up at the station. Low adobe walls, a covered porch sagging on one side, a hand-painted sign above the door, sun-bleached to near nothing. Behind the building, a stand of scraggly pines somehow still alive in all that rock and heat. It wasn't much, but it wasn't Missouri. That was enough. She picked up her trunk by the handle and dragged it toward the porch. Inside, she found Old Man Orson behind a plank counter, squinting at a ledger through spectacles held together with wire and stubbornness. He was compact and weathered, the kind of old that comes from decades of sun and stubbornness rather than from sitting still. He looked up at her over the rims. "You the one who wrote about the bookkeeping job?" he asked. "And the cooking," she said. "Evangeline Thorne, Eva." He set the spectacles down and looked her over. Not the way men in Missouri used to look her over, measuring her worth in dowry figures and social standing. He just looked, the way a man looks when he's trying to decide if someone can handle a hard season. "You know ledgers?" "I kept accounts for my father's shipping business for 4 years. You know how to cook for a rough crowd without complaining about it? I've been doing things I didn't want to do without complaining since I was 16, she said. I'd rather cook for a rough crowd than go back to doing that. Something in that answer seemed to settle it for him. He nodded once and stuck out a rough hand. "Orson Briggs, room and board plus wages. You start tomorrow." She shook it. "I start tonight." "Where's the kitchen?" He almost smiled. She was halfway through sorting his disaster of a pantry when she heard hooves. One horse, coming in at a steady trot. Nothing urgent about the sound. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped to the side window. The rider came in from the west, silhouetted against the last red smear of daylight. He was lean, trail-worn, the kind of man who'd been sleeping under open sky long enough that it stopped bothering him. His hat was pulled low, and his horse moved like it trusted him completely. He swung down in the yard without fanfare, looping the reins over the hitching post in one practiced motion. "That's Jesse Vance," Orson said from behind her. "Quiet former Army scout. Stays here when he passes through. Good man to have around." She watched him a moment longer. There was something still about him, even moving, like he was always listening for something other people couldn't hear. Then she heard other hooves. More than one. More than 5. She moved back to the window in the front room and saw them coming up the station road in a loose line. 7 riders, maybe 8. They were dressed in range clothes, but their rifles were too clean and their horses too well fed for ordinary cowhands. These men were paid, she could tell. She'd grown up around men who did other men's dirty work, and they all carried themselves the same way, like they were wearing someone else's anger. They pulled up in the yard. The man out front had a wide jaw and a thin scar running from his chin to his left ear. "Briggs!" he called out toward the porch, not even bothering to dismount. "Mr. Hollister sends his regards. You had 3 weeks to think on his offer. He'd like your answer tonight." Orson stepped out onto the porch slowly, unhurried. "My answer's the same. As it was 3 weeks ago," the old man said. "The Oakhaven Spring isn't for sale. Not to Hollister. Not to the railroad. Not to God Almighty, if he showed up with a briefcase." The man with the scar smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "That's a real shame, old man." He gave a small nod to the riders flanking him. 2 of them started to dismount. Eva's hands went cold. She looked around the room once, then crossed to the porch doorway and stayed just inside it, watching. Jesse Vance hadn't moved from beside his horse. He'd been watching the riders since they rode in. His thumbs were hooked in his belt, and he looked almost relaxed. Almost. Scarjaw's eyes flicked to him. "This ain't your business, Scout." "Sure isn't," Jesse agreed. His voice was low and even, like he was commenting on the weather. "But I'm standing here anyway." The 2 dismounted men kept moving toward the porch steps. What happened next was fast, much faster than Eva's mind could fully track. Jesse drew. One motion, clean and without drama, the Colt 0.45, clearing leather and leveling in the same breath. The crack of the first shot split the desert quiet wide open. The lead man dropped, not reached for his gun, not stumbled, dropped the way a puppet does when someone cuts the strings. The second man spun and grabbed for iron, and Jesse's second shot took him before the draw was even half finished. The remaining riders scrambled. Horses reared. 2 men turned and rode hard without looking back. 3 more took a long look at Jesse standing there in the yard, still as stone, smoke curling from the barrel, and decided the math didn't favor them tonight. Scarjaw was the last to pull his horse around. His jaw was tight. All that easy menace from a moment ago burned away. He pointed a finger at Orson. "Hollister will hear about this," he said. "Tell him I said hello," Orson replied. They rode out into the dark. Eva's pulse was hammering. She realized she'd gripped the doorframe so hard her knuckles had gone white. She made herself let go, made herself breathe through it. She'd seen men come to blows before. Back in Missouri. Seen a fistfight outside a tavern, one that left a man with a broken nose and 4 fewer teeth. But this was different. This was sudden and absolute, and without any of the warning she thought violence was supposed to give you. Jesse holstered the Colt. He looked down at his hands once, then back up at the dark road, then walked toward the porch, like nothing particularly remarkable had just occurred. He noticed her standing in the doorway. His eyes moved over her face briefly. "Brown eyes. Careful, you're new," he said. "Started an hour ago," she managed. He nodded, moved past her into the station. No apology for the violence. No swagger either. Just gone inside, like a man who'd done something unpleasant and necessary and didn't need praise or comfort for it. Orson came in behind her and found her standing at the wash basin, running cold water over her hands. She didn't know exactly when she'd started doing that. Her palms were red from the doorframe. The skin around her thumbs rubbed raw from the grip of the stagecoach handle all day. Orson looked at her hands and said nothing dramatic. He just pulled a clean cloth from the shelf and a small tin of salve. "Sit," he said. She sat. He drew up a stool and began wrapping the worst of the blistered spots with quiet efficiency, the kind of attention that asked nothing in return. "That man just killed 2 people," she said, keeping her voice level. "He did," Orson agreed. "And you're not." She stopped. She wasn't sure what she was asking. Orson tied off the cloth and looked up at her. His eyes were pale, blue, and kind in a way that didn't make you feel small for needing kindness. Out here in the desert, he said, a person's dignity isn't measured by where they came from or how fancy their dress is. It's measured by whether they have the grit to stand on their own 2 feet as a free human being. He patted the back of her bandaged hand once gently. Jesse Vance stood on his feet tonight. So did you. Walking out to that doorway instead of hiding, that counts for something. She looked down at the wrapped cloth around her palms. In the far corner of the station, Jesse sat with his back to the wall and his rifle across his knees, watching the dark road through the window. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He just watched. She didn't know what to make of him. She wasn't sure she wanted to. But she was here now. The spring was here. Orson needed help with his ledgers, and the pantry was a catastrophe. And somewhere out there, Sterling Hollister was going to send more men with cleaner rifles and worse intentions. Eva Thorne had not ridden all the way from Missouri to be frightened off by the first hard night. She got up, went back to the kitchen, and got to work. 3 days in, Eva had the ledgers sorted. That was no small thing. Orson kept his accounts the way a pack rat keeps a nest, everything in there somewhere. Nothing where it was supposed to be. Receipts tucked between Bible pages. Delivery logs rolled up and stuffed behind the sugar barrel. A full year of water-sharing records, written in the margins of a seed catalog from 1874. She pulled it all out, spread it across the kitchen table after supper, each night, cross-referenced, reconciled, organized by month and then by category. By the third morning, she had a clear picture of Whispering Pines, and what she saw made her sit back in her chair and stare at the ceiling for a long moment. The station was barely breaking even, but not for the reasons she'd expected. Orson was giving things away, not carelessly, not blindly. There was a system to it, hidden in the margins and the irregular entries, once you knew how to read it. 50 gallons of water, delivered to the Running Water family, north of the Mesa. 40 gallons to the Sozi camp, on the far side of the ridge. Small entries, never labeled outright. Noted only by initials and dates, month after month. After month, she found Jesse in the yard that afternoon, checking over his horse's front shoe. She stood at the porch rail with the seed catalog in one hand. The water deliveries, she said. The ones to the Diné families north and east of here. That's you, isn't it? You're the one making the runs. He didn't look up from the hoof he was inspecting. Orson's the one who opens the spring. And you're the one who carries it out to people Hollister's men would run off the road if they caught them hauling it themselves. He set the hoof down, straightened up, looked at her the way she was starting to recognize that measuring look, not unfriendly, just careful. Those families were using that spring long before Hollister ever heard of Arizona Territory, he said. Long before the railroad decided water was something a man could own. He picked up his hat from the fence post and settled it on. Orson believes a natural spring doesn't belong to any one person. It belongs to whoever needs it to live. I happen to agree with him. She looked down at the catalog in her hands. Hollister's men are going to figure it out eventually, the deliveries. They probably already suspect. That makes it more dangerous, not less. Yes, he said simply, and went back to his horse. She watched him a moment. He wasn't being dismissive. He wasn't being brave in the performed way that men back in Missouri were brave, all chest and noise and wanting you to notice. He was just stating a fact. Dangerous or not, the thing was the right thing to do, so it's going to keep getting done. She went back inside and adjusted the ledgers so the water entries were better disguised. That evening, Hollister's message arrived, not in person, by rider, a single man who handed Orson a sealed envelope, and left without a word. Orson read it at the kitchen table, then passed it to Eva without comment. The language was formal, but the meaning was plain. Sterling Hollister, acting as agent for the Territorial Railroad Development Authority, was providing official notice that all supply routes to Whispering Pines Way Station would be suspended indefinitely, effective within 10 days. pending resolution of the contested water rights claim on Oakhaven Spring. No flour, salt, no lamp oil, no mail, no stagecoach stops. A blockade. He can do this? Eva asked. He's got enough men in enough pockets, Orson said. Legally, probably not. Practically, yes. Then we file the water rights at the territorial court. Properly. With documentation. She was already thinking through the ledgers. What could be used as evidence? You have records going back years. If we get those in front of a judge, before Hollister cuts off our access to the road, we establish the prior claim. Orson nodded slowly. Been meaning to do that for 2 years. He waved a hand at the station around him. I know. You've been busy keeping everyone fed and watered. She folded the letter and set it on the table. We ride to Tucson within the week. Jesse, standing in the doorway, said nothing, but he didn't argue. That, she'd learned, was as close as Jesse Vance got to agreement. That night, she worked later than usual, copying out the relevant ledger entries in clean, careful script. The lamp oil was low. She rationed it, writing by the shrinking circle of yellow light until her fingers cramped. She heard him before she saw him. A soft step in the back hallway, then the sound of water being poured. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding a tin cup and a folded cloth. He'd been out behind the station earlier. She hadn't heard what happened, but she'd seen him come back in with his left shoulder angled stiff, his shirt torn at the seam. He'd said nothing about it at supper. Just ate with his right arm and passed the bread basket with the same hand. Now he sat down across the table from her and set the cup on the edge near her papers. Water, not coffee, then began working at his own shoulder with the cloth. The tear in the shirt showed a long graze across the top of the shoulder, red and raw, shallow enough not to be dangerous, but ugly enough to need cleaning. She looked at it, then at him. You're not going to be able to reach the back half of that, she said. He glanced at the shoulder. I'll manage. You won't. Sit still. She got up, found the salve tin and a clean cloth, and came around the table. He didn't protest again. He went quiet and still, which she'd noticed was what Jesse Vance did when he'd run out of a reason to argue. She worked the cloth across the graze carefully, cleaning it out. He didn't flinch. She wasn't sure if that was toughness or just practice. She was standing close. Closer than she'd stood to a man in a long time, without her whole body going tense with the need to step back. Strangely, it didn't. The kitchen was dim, the lamp burning low, the sound of desert wind against the walls. His shoulder was warm under her hands, and he smelled like dust and pine resin and old leather. She could feel him noticing the closeness, too. Not in a reaching way, more like an awareness, both of them aware of it, and neither one pretending they weren't. She smoothed the salve on and pressed a clean square of cloth over it. You're good at that, he said, quiet. My mother was practical about injuries, she said. Dramatic reactions to blood were a luxury, and most people couldn't afford luxuries. He was quiet a moment, then, where's your mother now? Gone. 6 years. She stepped back, picking up the cloth. My father remarried inside the year. His new wife found me inconveniently independent. My father found me a fiancé, who he thought would correct that. She said it matter of fact. No performance of pain in it. He was wrong about the correcting. Jesse turned his head and looked at her. Not with pity, with something quieter than that. You should go back to your papers, he said. Probably. But he said it like he meant the opposite, and she stood there a breath too long before she did. Don't, he said then. His voice had dropped, gone flat in a careful way. Don't make something of this. A man with blood on his hands isn't a project, and he isn't a safe thing to get close to. I'm telling you that plainly because you seem like a woman who prefers plain. She looked at him. I'm not looking for safe. I stopped looking for safe in Missouri. That's not the same as saying dangerous is good. No, she agreed. It isn't. She picked up her pen. Good night, Mr. Vance. He stood, settled his chair back in without noise, and went to his post by the front window. She wrote until the lamp gave out. They left before sunrise. Orson's old buckboard, the 3 of them, plus the document case Eva had spent 4 days carefully assembling. Every relevant ledger entry copied clean. The original water allocation records, dating back to 1869. A signed letter from 3 neighboring homesteaders attesting to Oakhaven Springs' long-established public use. She'd stitched the whole packet into oilskin to protect against weather. Jesse rode alongside on his horse rather than up on the buckboard. He'd loaded the rifle scabbard that morning and checked his Colt twice without comment. Eva noticed. She also noticed he'd chosen a route through the maps. Orson kept in the back room, tracing it with one finger in the lamplight at 4 in the morning, looking for high ground and sight lines rather than speed. The first hour was quiet. Desert morning, cold and clean and purple at the edges, the mesas rising black against a brightening sky. Orson drove and hummed something low to himself. Eva sat with the document case in her lap and watched the landscape open up around them, then the canyon. Red Canyon was narrow, sandstone walls rising 60 feet on either side, the trail running along the dry creek bed at the bottom. It was the most direct route. Jesse had looked at it on the map for a long time last night. He hadn't said don't go through it, but he'd looked at it for a long time. They were 40 yards into the narrows when Eva heard the click. Not the sound of rocks settling, not a bird. She knew the sound of a rifle being cocked, and her whole body knew it before her mind caught up. Down, Jesse said. One word, and his horse was already moving. The first shot cracked off the canyon wall and kicked up stone chips 6 inches from Orson's left hand. The old man hauled the reins hard. The second shot was closer. Orson made a sound. Eva turned. The old man had his right hand clamped to his side, below the ribs, fingers already going dark with blood. His face was white. He was still holding the reins. "I've got it," she said, and grabbed them from him. Jesse had already cleared the buckboard and gone to ground behind a boulder, returning fire up at the canyon rim. She could see at least 3 positions up there. Muzzle smoke drifting lazy in the still air, professional placement. They'd been set up ahead of time. Eva, Jesse's voice level and sharp. "Get Orson low in the bed. Keep the buckboard between you and the west rim." She did it. Orson was conscious but diminishing, his breath coming in shallow pulls. She pressed her folded jacket against the wound with both hands, her heart hammering, and kept her head below the buckboard's side rail. The shooting continued in the canyon. Jesse moved between boulders with an economy of motion she wouldn't have believed if she hadn't watched it. No wasted steps, no hesitation. He was locating each position, drawing fire to track the shooter, answering it. One position went quiet, then another, but there were more than 3. She heard them working around the south end of the canyon, trying to flank. Jesse heard it too. She watched him change direction, cutting off the angle, moving into territory that had no cover at all, just open creek bed and exposed sandstone. Going fast and low, the shots from the south rim came hard and rapid. A ricochet screamed off the boulder 6 feet from her head, and then she felt it, under her boots pressed to the buckboard floor. A vibration, low and building, coming from somewhere up the canyon above them. Not gunfire, something heavier, something that had nothing to do with men. She looked up the canyon, north, toward the high country they'd come from. The sky up there had gone a strange greenish dark. Jesse was suddenly at the buckboard, grabbing her arm. "Leave the case," he said. "I won't." Eva. His eyes were not arguing with her. They were just telling her what was true. "Leave the case. Take Orson's other arm now." She heard it then, not a vibration anymore. A sound. A low, continuous roar building behind the canyon walls, getting bigger, the way thunder gets bigger, except it wasn't stopping. She looked north and saw the wall of brown water come around the upper bend of the canyon like something alive and furious, 6 feet high and full of torn brush and rock and everything the desert had been saving for this moment. She grabbed the document case and shoved it inside her coat. Jesse had Orson off the buckboard and over his shoulder in one motion. The man was not small. Jesse moved anyway across the creek bed and up the talus slope at the canyon wall, climbing hard. Eva was right behind him, her boots slipping on loose rock, climbing with her hands when her feet couldn't find purchase. The water hit the buckboard behind them with a sound like a cannon going off. She felt the spray on the back of her neck, ice cold, and kept climbing. 20 feet. 30. The roar below was enormous, filling the whole canyon with sound and mist. Jesse found the ledge. It was maybe 8 feet wide, protected by a rock overhang deep enough to call it a cave if you were being generous. He got Orson inside and turned back for her. She didn't need the hand, but she took it. The last scramble up the loose rock, too steep to manage alone without dropping the case. They pulled back against the cave wall and watched the canyon floor become a river. The buckboard went. The horses had broken free before it hit. She didn't know when. Gone now. The water was brown and violent and moving fast, carrying everything it touched. She was soaked through. The spray had found her on the climb. Her dress was plastered to her, and the cold was already in her hands, her face, the back of her neck, where the wind hit the wet cloth. Orson was conscious, barely. His lips were moving. Jesse was already looking at the wound. He'd pulled a folded piece of oilcloth from inside his coat, kept the rifle wrapped in it, apparently. He pressed it against the wound in place of her jacket. Looked at Eva. "Hold it firm," he said. She held it. Jesse moved to the edge of the overhang and looked down at the flood, then up at the canyon rim. The shooters were gone. The flood had made the canyon floor impassable for men and horses as thoroughly as if God had pulled a curtain across it. The rain started properly then. What had been a distant roar of weather became a reality on the rock, cold, hard, drumming on the sandstone above them. The temperature dropped fast, fast enough that she felt it happen, felt the warmth leaving her wet clothes and not being replaced. She looked at Orson. His eyes were closed. His chest was moving. She looked at Jesse, who was standing at the cave entrance in the rain with his rifle, watching the canyon walls above them with those quiet, careful eyes. The wind found the cave opening and pushed inside. She pressed closer to the wall and held the oilcloth tight against Orson's side, and told herself the shivering was manageable. It was for now. Outside, the flood roared below them, and the rain came down, and the desert dark closed in from all sides. And the three of them were alone, up in the Red Rock, with Hollister's men somewhere above, and no horses and nowhere to go until the water went down. Jesse fed rounds into the rifle, slowly, methodically. Then he sat at the cave mouth and watched the dark, and Eva understood that whatever came up those walls tonight was going to have to get through him first. That was either reassuring or terrifying. She hadn't decided which. She held the cloth tight and listened to Orson breathe and waited for morning. The fire was small. It had to be. Jesse had found dry wood tucked back in a crack where the overhang met the cave wall, enough for a modest flame, enough to keep a man alive, but not enough to advertise their position to anyone still watching from the rim above. He built it low and careful, no higher than his knee, and positioned himself between it and the cave mouth so the light wouldn't carry. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it had gotten worse in the last hour, driving in sideways on a wind that found every opening in the rock and pushed cold air through, like it was looking for something. Outside, the flood still moved through the canyon floor, lower now but still running hard, a steady roar that filled the silence between the rain gusts. Eva was shivering. She'd been shivering since they climbed up. She'd been managing it, holding herself steady, pressing her attention into Orson, checking the wound, monitoring his breathing, keeping herself occupied and useful. Because that was what she did when things went wrong. She kept moving. She kept working. It had always been enough. It wasn't quite enough anymore. Her clothes were soaked through entirely. The rain on the climb had found everything, her dress, her underskirt, the corset beneath, all of it plastered cold against her skin. The fire put heat into the air, but the wet cloth pulled it right back out again before it could do much good. Her hands, pressing the oilcloth against Orson's side, had gone from shaking to something past shaking, a deep bone-level trembling she couldn't talk herself out of. Orson had gone quiet. He was breathing, still, but shallow and slow, the kind of sleep that wasn't quite sleep. His color was bad. The bleeding had slowed, which was good, but the cold was working on him now, the same as it was working on her. Jessie crouched across the fire from her. He'd been watching her for a few minutes without saying anything. She knew because she'd felt it, that quiet, measuring attention he had. "You need to get out of the wet clothes," he said. She looked up. His face was entirely serious. No edge to it, no invitation. Just a practical assessment of a practical problem, stated plainly, because that was how he stated things. She looked down at herself. She knew he was right. She also felt the old, cold weight of it settle over her, the reflex she'd spent years building, every nerve pulling taut. Her hands found her top button and stopped. She stared at the fire. The trembling in her hands wasn't just the cold now, and she knew it. It was Missouri. It was her father's business partner, with his damp hands and his ledger of what she was worth. It was her fiancé, who'd explained on their second meeting, in the same tone a man uses to discuss livestock arrangements, what would be expected of her once they were wed. It was every room she'd stood in where a man decided what her body was for before she'd had a single word to say about it. Her fingers wouldn't move. "What happens after I undress?" She hadn't meant to say it out loud. It came out thin and unsteady, and she hated the sound of it, hated that her voice did that, hated that after everything she'd done to get away from Missouri. The fear had followed her all the way to a sandstone cave in Arizona Territory, and was sitting on her chest like a stone. Her eyes were wet. She hadn't decided to let that happen either. Jessie didn't move immediately. He looked at her across the small fire, and she waited for whatever came next. The dismissal, the reassurance that felt like pressure, the gentle coaxing that was just a slower version of the same old claim. He reached into his coat. He pulled out a folding pocket knife. Plain handle, good steel. He leaned across the fire and held it out, handle first, and waited until she took it. Her fingers closed around it automatically. Then he stood up. He stripped off the sheepskin coat he'd been wearing, the one that had stayed relatively dry under the overhang during the climb. He draped it over her shoulders, the weight of it settling warm and heavy over the wet dress. It smelled like wood smoke and horse and worn leather. He turned his back to her completely, walked to the cave entrance, and sat down with his rifle across his knees, facing the dark and the rain and the canyon below. "Other men treated you like property to be claimed," he said, his voice quiet, aimed out at the rain and not at her. "My answer is this. I'm pulling night watch. No one, including me, touches you without your consent. Under this rock, you are the only one who commands your body." The cave was quiet, except for the fire and the rain and Orson's slow breathing. Eva sat still for a moment. The knife was solid in her palm. She turned it over once, feeling the weight of it, what it meant that he'd handed it to her, not as a threat, not as a performance. He'd handed it to her and turned his back, which meant he wasn't watching to see if she put it down. He didn't need her gratitude. He wasn't waiting for her to feel safe enough to become something available. He just sat there in the rain and watched the dark. She got up and moved to the back of the cave. She stripped out of the wet dress and underskirt and her soaked stockings, working fast against the cold, and wrapped herself in the sheepskin coat, which came down past her knees and covered enough. She draped the wet clothes over a rock near the fire, close enough to begin drying, and came back to Orson's side. She felt the trembling ease. Not gone, but different. The cold was still there, but the other part, the weight that had been sitting on her ribs since her hands found that first button, had shifted, gone lighter. Something in her chest had unclenched, very quietly, like a fist opening. She looked at Jessie's back at the cave mouth. He'd told her a man with blood on his hands wasn't safe. He'd said it plainly, and she believed he meant it as a warning, not a boast. He'd done terrible things. She didn't know the full count of them, but she was beginning to understand that what a man had done and what a man chose to do were two different ledgers, and Jesse Vance kept his current accounts very carefully. She pulled the knife out and set it near her knee where she could reach it easily. Then she pressed her hand back against Orson's wound and stared at the fire. "Jesse," she said. He didn't turn. "Yeah, thank you." He was quiet a moment. "Get some sleep when you can. I'll take watch until morning." She didn't sleep, but the shivering stopped. She sat with Orson through the long, cold hours, tracking his breathing, keeping pressure on the wound when the oilcloth soaked through and needed adjusting. The fire burned down, and she fed it carefully from the dwindling woodpile. Jessie stayed at the cave mouth, motionless, just breathing, just watching. Around what she guessed was 2 in the morning, the rain began to ease. The flood sound from the canyon floor softened, dropped from a roar to a rush, and then to a lower murmur. By the time the sky at the canyon rim started going pale gray, with the earliest suggestion of morning, the creek bed below was passable. Muddy and chewed up, but passable. Jesse came back from the cave mouth and crouched near Orson. He checked the old man's pulse with 2 fingers against his throat, checked his breathing, looked at the wound. "We move at first light," he said. "He needs a doctor." "I know. There's a settlement 4 miles east. I can carry him if I have to." Eva looked at Jesse. He'd been awake all night in the rain and cold, and he was already working out the logistics of carrying an unconscious man 4 miles through muddy canyon country. She thought about pointing out that he'd need to rest at some point. She decided not to bother. She was starting to understand that telling Jesse Vance to rest was approximately as useful as telling the sun to rise later. She got back into her dress. It wasn't dry, but it was drier. The surface stiffened and cold. She pulled it on fast and belted it, and handed him back the sheepskin coat. He took it without comment. She folded the knife and held it out to him. He looked at it, then at her. "Keep it," he said. She put it in her pocket. The light came up slow and red over the canyon rim, and they started down the talus together with Orson between them. Orson made it back to the station, barely. Jesse carried him the last mile, not because Eva hadn't tried, but because Orson had slipped in and out of consciousness twice during the walk, and when a man's legs stop cooperating entirely, 2 people carrying him becomes 1 person carrying him, while the other steadies the load. Eva steadied. Jesse carried. By the time Whispering Pines came into view across the scrub flats, she was running ahead of them to get the bed ready and the water boiling. There was a settler woman, Mrs. Delacroix, 2 miles up the road, who had some nursing experience. Eva had her there within the hour. Jesse sat outside on the porch and didn't come in. The doctor from town arrived the following morning, a tight-faced man named Pryor, who looked at the wound, looked at Jesse, and looked at Eva with the particular expression of a man who had decided several things about the situation without being told any of them. He did his job, at least. He stitched and packed and dozed. He said Orson was stable. He said the word stable, like it was doing a lot of work, holding back a less comfortable word. They kept watching shifts. Eva took days, Jesse took nights, Orson drifted. He was lucid in the mornings, not quite himself in the afternoons, somewhere else entirely by dark. Mrs. Delacroix came each day and stayed several hours. Hatali Martha, the Dine healer, who lived up near the North Ridge, arrived on the 2nd day with a leather bag full of things that smelled like sage and pine bark, and something sweetly bitter Eva couldn't name. She worked on Orson quietly and efficiently, and the fever that had been climbing since the first night broke by the following morning. Eva thanked her. Martha looked at her with dark, steady eyes and said, "He is a good man. The land knows its good people." On the 4th day, Orson woke up clear-eyed and asked for coffee. Eva made it. She brought it in and sat on the edge of the bed and watched him drink it, and felt something in herself relax that had been pulled tight since the canyon. He didn't waste time. "Get the deed box," he said. "The iron one, under the floor plank at the back of the storeroom. Orson." "Now, Eva," while I'm still thinking straight. She got it. It took her 10 minutes to find the right plank and another 5 to get the box open with the key he directed her to. When she came back, he had himself sitting up against the headboard and looked, for just that hour, almost like himself. He signed the deed over to her at the kitchen table. Both of them, Orson and Jesse as witness, the document folded and placed back in the oilskin Eva had retrieved from her coat in the cave, which had kept the papers inside dry enough to survive. Whispering Pine Station, Oakhaven, Spring. All of it legally hers. "You'll do right by it," Orson said. He wasn't asking. "I will," she said. He squeezed her hand once, went back to bed, and didn't wake up again. He passed just after sunset on the 5th day, quietly in his sleep while the desert outside went pink and gold and enormous with dying light. Eva sat beside him for a long time afterward. Jesse stood in the doorway and said nothing. She didn't need him to say anything. They buried him at sunrise in the grove of pines behind the station that gave the place its name. Martha came. 3 Dine families came. 2 neighboring homesteaders came, men who'd signed her witness letters, who'd known Orson for decades. They stood in the cool morning light while Jesse said a few plain words about a man who'd understood that dignity wasn't something you could purchase, and that water didn't belong to anyone who hadn't made it. Eva couldn't speak. She stood straight and kept her eyes dry until the last of the dirt was settled over him. And then she went inside and cried briefly and efficiently into a dish towel and got back to work. She was in the middle of reviewing the station accounts when she heard the horses. Not one, not a few. She heard the gate, the creak of leather, the particular clustered sound of organized men arriving with a purpose. She was on the porch before the dust settled. There were 8 of them. Hollister in front, dressed in a dark coat that cost more money than the station took. In a month, his self-appointed colonel's bearing, carrying itself with a kind of practiced authority that was almost convincing if you didn't look at his eyes. Beside him, a man wearing a deputy marshal's badge that caught the sun. Behind them 6 riders, and one more. A thin, still man on a gray horse, hanging back slightly. A bounty hunter's stillness about him, present everywhere, and attached to nothing. Jesse came around the corner of the station from the watershed, and he stopped when he saw the formation. He put himself between it and the porch without making a production of doing so. Hollister pulled a folded document from his coat and held it out, not to Jesse, to Eva. "Miss Thorne," he said pleasantly, "I'm afraid there's a warrant. She didn't take it." "For what?" "Theft of family assets. Filed in Missouri. Your late father's estate, apparently, has some questions about money that went missing from the household accounts before you left." Her stomach turned over. She kept her face still. "That's a lie. That may well be," he said, radiating false reasonableness. "But the law requires that it be resolved before a judge. The warrant is legitimate. The deputy marshal here can attest to that." He glanced at the man with the badge, who nodded on cue. "Additionally, the deed you claim to hold on this property will need to be verified, as there are competing claims that predate your arrangement with the late Mr. Briggs. The deed is properly witnessed and signed, so you say." He smiled. "We'll let the courts sort it out. In the meantime, the property is under the jurisdiction of the marshal's office." Jesse stepped forward 1 pace. His hand wasn't near his gun. He wasn't threatening anything. His was just closer, and everyone noticed. "The deed is legal," he said. "You know it is." Hollister's eyes moved to him with what looked like genuine pleasure. "Mr. Vance, I was hoping you'd be here, actually." He reached into his coat again, another document. "I have here a warrant for your arrest as well. Escaped outlaw, filing jurisdiction of the Arizona Territorial Court, criminal conspiracy relating to your activities in Yavapai County in 1873. He paused, and then said it precisely, like he'd been saving it. "Activities conducted. The record shows as an agent of my operations." The yard went silent. Eva looked at Jesse. His jaw was tight. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Hollister with the flat, absolute stillness of a man who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and has just watched it arrive. "Tell her," Hollister said. "Tell her what you were before you became a hero." Jesse was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said it. Low and even, his voice aimed at the ground between him and Eva. I worked for him, 1,872 to 1,873. I was running up family debt I couldn't pay any other way. Ran intimidation on homesteaders. Pressured a water claim in Yavapai. He stopped. Then I saw what we did to a family up near the Gila. I walked away. He ran away. Hollister said pleasantly. Without completing his contract, I walked away, Jesse repeated. Eva stood on the porch and looked at him. She thought about the ledger entries, the water deliveries, the all-night watch at the cave mouth. The knife handle held out to her in the firelight. She knew what she thought about what she was hearing, but it didn't matter what she thought right now. The deputy marshal had moved his horse up beside Jesse, and 2 of the riders had flanked out to Jesse's sides. Don't, she said. Jesse looked at her then. One look. She couldn't read all of it. Something in it was an apology. Something else in it was telling her to hold her ground no matter what came next. The deputy marshal came down from his horse. He had irons in his hand. Jesse didn't reach for his gun. He stood and let them put the irons on him because there were 8 men and a marshal's warrant, and because drawing here would get Eva killed, and she understood that was the only reason he stood still for it. The deputy marshal pistol whipped him once across the side of the head, fast and casual, the way you do something you've done plenty of times before. Jesse went sideways, caught himself on one knee in the dirt, and came back upright, blood on his temple. They hauled him to a horse and tied him across the saddle like cargo. Hollister turned back to Eva. You'll remain on the premises, Miss Thorne. You'll have a guard. Think of it as house arrest, while the legal matters are attended to. Comfortable enough. He held out his hand. She looked at it. The deed, please. She thought about the knife in her pocket. She thought about how many men were in the yard. She thought about Jesse, ironed and blood-faced, and being led away into the desert dark with everything falling apart around her. She handed over the deed. Hollister folded it into his coat without looking at it, already turning his horse. The riders fell in. The bounty hunter followed without speaking, which was somehow the worst thing about him. Jesse was led away. He didn't look back. The last rider posted himself at the station gate, rifle across his saddle. The sun was fully down now, and the stars were coming out over the messes, indifferent and clean. The same stars that had been there before all this, and would be there long after. Eva stood on the porch of a station that was legally hers, under armed guard, stripped of the document that proved it, watching the road swallow the man who'd sat up all night in the rain to protect her. She stood there until the hoofbeats faded into nothing. Then she went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and started thinking. She had one advantage. Hollister had done what men like him always did. He'd looked at her and decided she was the problem already solved. He'd taken the deed and left a single guard and ridden off satisfied with himself. He hadn't thought about what she might do next. That was his first mistake. She intended to make sure it wasn't his last. She pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and she began to write. The guard's name was Cutter. She learned that by listening. Talked to himself when he was bored, which was often. He muttered about the heat, about his pay, about a woman named Delia back in Prescott, who apparently owed him $20. He walked the perimeter of the station in a loose, irregular loop, stopping longest at the corner nearest the road where he could see farthest, shortest at the back where the pines blocked his sightline. And there was nothing to look at but rock and scrub. Eva cataloged all of this from the window over the kitchen basin, washing the same 3 dishes slowly, and at different hours, over 2 days until she had his pattern complete. He checked her room once at dusk and once before his own sleep, knocking twice and waiting for her voice before moving on. He wasn't cruel about it. He was just doing a job. That almost made it harder, the professional indifference of it, but it also made him predictable, and predictable was what she needed. On the second night, she cooked extra. She made biscuits, a full pan, more than she could eat, and brought a plate to the door for him with coffee. He took it with the wariness of a man who expected poison and the hunger of a man who'd been eating his own camp, cooking for a week. She smiled pleasantly and said nothing provocative and went back inside. On the third night, she did it again. This time she mentioned, casually, that the flour barrel was nearly empty, and she'd need to check the back storeroom, which Hollister's orders had locked. Cutter shrugged and unlocked it for her. She took long enough in there to establish that she needed regular access, and he stopped bothering to relock it after the second time. The storeroom had a low window that faced the pine grove. She spent that afternoon composing 2 letters. The first was to the Tsozi family, whose eldest son, Nayeli, was 16 and fast on horseback, in careful plain language that told them what had happened and asked for word to be passed along the ridge to the other families, and to Hatali Martha. The second was to Ben Alcott and Dre Ferris, the 2 homesteaders who'd signed her witness letters, asking them to come to the station road on the 4th morning with any men they could bring. She encoded both, not elaborate code. She didn't have time for elaborate. She shifted every name to a landmark both parties would recognize, used compass directions for people, used weather terms for actions. It was the same kind of margin shorthand she'd used in Orson's ledgers, the one that had taken her 3 days to decode. She was counting on Hollister's men if they intercepted the letters. Taking longer than that, she folded them small, wrapped them in oilskin from the supply shelf. That evening, she told Cutter, she needed to check the pine grove for deadfall, that Orson always collected it for the kitchen fire, and she was running low on wood. He came with her, which she expected. She moved through the grove naturally, picking up branches, stacking them in her arms, making the whole thing look as purposeful and tedious as possible. At the east edge of the grove, she stopped to work loose a branch caught in the roots of the largest pine. She worked at it with her back to Cutter, and while her right hand pulled at the branch, her left hand pressed the folded oilskin packet into the hollow at the base of the tree, the one she'd noticed 3 days ago, because it was perfectly sized and faced away from the station. She'd told Nayeli where it would be in the letter she hadn't written yet. That letter went out the following morning in the flour sack she sent Cutter to retrieve from the locked supply wagon Hollister had parked at the gate. She'd asked for flour. She got it. The note went into the returned empty sack, tucked into a flour-dusted fold, where a man who wasn't looking wouldn't find it. She didn't know if it would work. She had no confirmation, no reply, no way to know if anyone was listening. On the other end of her careful, improvised chain. She did it anyway, because sitting still and waiting for Hollister to finish arranging her life was not something she was built for. On the 6th morning, she looked out the pine side window before dawn and found the hollow at the base of the large tree empty. Someone had been there in the night. Someone had taken the packet. She let out a breath she'd been holding for 6 days, went back to the kitchen, and made coffee. 3 days later, she heard it, a sound from the north ridge she'd learned to distinguish from coyotes and wind, a sharp, descending whistle that the Dene riders used on clear nights when the canyon walls would carry sound. Nayeli, she thought, or one of the men. The message was received. The alliance was moving. Now she just needed Jesse to still be alive to use it. She was standing at the porch window the following evening when the first of Hollister's posted guards vanished. Not dramatically. He was there at the east at sundown, and when Cutter made his round an hour later, the post was empty. Cutter swore, checked the road, found nothing, and posted himself there instead, which meant he was no longer checking her room. 2 nights later, the guard on the south approach to the spring didn't show up for the morning change. The morning after that, the one who'd been sleeping in Orson's barn went quiet before midnight. No bodies, no noise, no sign of a fight. Just absence, one by one, methodical and patient, reaching in from the dark and removing Hollister's posted men like a hand clearing pieces from a board. Eva stood on the porch in the early dark, and looked out at the high rocks surrounding the station, the sandstone ridges, and the long black shadows between them. She couldn't see anything. She knew that meant exactly nothing. "Jesse Vance," she said quietly, to the dark and the rock and the enormous desert sky. No answer. She hadn't expected one. She went inside, put the knife from her pocket on the table where she could see it, and slept better than she had in 2 weeks. Cutter lasted another 3 days on his own, before he saddled his horse and rode out at 3 in the morning without a word to anyone. She heard him go. She lay in bed and listened to the hoofbeats and didn't move until they'd faded completely. Then she got up, lit the lamp, and got back to work. She was sewing when he came through the window. Not dramatically. The window latch lifted from the outside with a thin piece of wire she hadn't known was possible. And then Jesse Vance was inside her room, pulling the window closed behind him, moving quiet across the floor to the wall, beside the door where the shadows were deepest. She had the knife in her hand before she'd consciously reached for it. She put it down when she saw his face in the moonlight coming through the yellow curtains. Those curtains, flour sack fabric she'd dyed with desert marigold, boiled in a tin pot the second week she was here, because Orson's window had been bare, and the desert mornings deserved something warmer than plain glass. Jesse looked at the knife on the table, looked at her, and almost smiled. "Still carrying it," he said. "You told me to keep it," she said. "Sit down before you fall down." He looked like a man who'd been living in the high rocks for 2 weeks, because that was exactly what he was. His face was leaner, darkened further by sun and wind. There was a healing cut across his right cheekbone, from the pistol whipping, gone to the greenish-yellow stage. Now, the worst of it passed. His coat was dusty, and his boots were worn through at the left heel. He moved with the same economy he always had, but more carefully, like a man managing something that hurt when he moved quickly. He sat in the chair at her small table. She brought water first, then the tin of salve, then what was left of the medical cloth she'd been rationing. She didn't ask how he'd escaped. She asked, "How many ribs?" He looked down at his left side. 2. Maybe. 1 for certain. From the irons or from after? After. She worked around it carefully, the same focus she'd had in the cave, the same steady hands. He sat still and let her, and didn't make any sounds about it. The cut on his cheekbone was healed enough to leave alone. The ribs she wrapped tightly with the remaining cloth, not perfectly, but firmly enough to hold. When she finished, she sat back and looked at him across the small table. The moonlight through the yellow curtains was soft and indirect. The station was quiet. Hollister's last posted man had left 2 days ago, but she knew there were others, positioned at the road and at the spring access. Men she couldn't see from the station, men Jesse had been managing from the rocks, one careful evening at a time. "You came back," she said. "I said I would. You said you'd never leave my side again. You didn't say how long you'd be gone first." He looked at her. His eyes were tired but present. Fair point. She folded the extra cloth and set it aside. "You're past," she said. "What Hollister said. The work you did for him." He met her eyes. He didn't look away, and he didn't offer anything extra, just waited to hear where she was going. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself," she said. "You already told me. You walked away after damage was already done." "Yes, after damage was already done." She left that where it was for a moment. "The water deliveries. Orson Spring. The way you've been living in those rocks for 2 weeks instead of riding for the border. That's also you. That doesn't cancel out the rest." "I didn't say it did." She looked at him steadily. "I said I can see your character through your actions. Both sets of them, the past ones and the present ones. I'm a bookkeeper. I know how to read a full ledger, not just the most recent entry." Something moved across his face. Not quite relief, more like a man setting down something heavy that he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten what his hands felt like, empty. She leaned forward slightly. "I want to stay. I'm not leaving this station, Jesse. Not for Hollister, not for the warrant, not for anything my father's lawyers cook up in Missouri. Orson left this place to me and the spring to everyone who needs it, and I intend to make sure that means something. Jessie was quiet for a moment. Then I can get you out. There are people who'd help you to California. New name, fresh start. Hollister can't reach that far, I know, she said. I'm not going. He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze without moving. She'd made her decision days ago, sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight with Orson's empty chair across from her. This was her life now. This station, this spring, this desert that asked hard things from the people who loved it and gave extraordinary things back. She hadn't come all the way from Missouri to run from the next difficult man who decided he owned something that wasn't his. Jesse leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor between them for a moment. Then he looked back up. When I was riding out with the army, he said slowly, I came through a DNA settlement north of the Chuska Mountains. Elder there told me something. Said the land doesn't need men to own it. It needs men to respect it. Said the same thing goes for people. He paused. I've been thinking about that for a long time. So have I, she said, since a cave in Red Canyon when a man handed me a knife and turned his back. The space between them had gone very still. Moonlight, the soft sound of wind against the adobe. Somewhere out in the pine grove, a night bird called once and fell quiet. She stood up. He stood up, a breath behind her, close in the small room. She kissed him first. She wanted to be clear about that later. She stepped forward and put her hand against his jaw and kissed him. And he kissed her back with the kind of attention a man gives something he's been trying not to want for a long time, and has finally stopped arguing with himself about. It wasn't about possession. She knew that from the first second of it. It was two people choosing, both of them choosing, and that was different from everything she'd thought kissing was supposed to be. When she pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, and neither of them moved for a moment. I can't promise you quiet, he said. Hollister's not done. What's coming in the next few days is going to be worse than what's already happened. I know. You could still go, Jesse. Yeah, whether I stay here or walk into the gates of hell, she said quietly, watching his face. I'd rather not do it alone. He straightened up. He looked at her with those careful, tired, honest eyes, and he said it like a man who had thought hard about every word before he used it. Whether you stay here or walk into the gates of hell, this cowboy is never leaving your side again. She stepped back and sat on the edge of the bed. He pulled the chair to the door, picked up his rifle, and positioned himself the same way. He'd positioned himself at the cave mouth in Red Canyon, back straight, eyes on the darkness outside, watching, guarding, present. She lay down on her side and looked at his silhouette against the yellow curtains, and felt, for the first time since Missouri, that she was exactly where she'd chosen to be. Outside, the Arizona night was enormous and cold and full of stars. They had work to do in the morning. Both of them knew it. Hollister was regrouping, the alliance was gathering, and the spring still needed protecting, and the deed still needed recovering, and there was a fight coming that neither of them could walk away from. But tonight the station was quiet, and Jessie Vance was at her door, and Eva Thorne slept. Hollister came back with more men. Eva counted them from the pine grove at first light, staying low behind the biggest tree, watching the road. 14 riders, plus 6 railroad workers, with survey equipment, and 2 wagons loaded with crates she recognized from the shape, blasting powder. The crates sat low on the wagon axles, heavy, wrapped in oilcloth and roped down. Careful. He wasn't coming to negotiate. He was coming to make Oak Haven Spring unusable. Dynamite a spring correctly, and you don't destroy the water. You redirect it. Collapse the natural stone basin, blow the channel sideways, and the flow diverts underground to wherever the new fractures take it. It might resurface a mile away, or 3 miles away, or not at all. Either way, the families who'd been drawing from it for generations would have nothing, and Hollister's railroad could run a private pipe to wherever the water resurfaced and call it infrastructure. She went back inside and told Jessie. He was already loading rifle cartridges into his coat pockets. He looked up when she gave him the count. Something in his expression sharpened, the way iron sharpens in a fire, harder and more defined than before. "The Alliance," he said. "How close?" Nayeli wrote out last night. Ben Alcott said 2 days, at the outside. "We don't have 2 days, I know," she thought for a moment. "Hollister's going to move the blasting powder to the spring this morning. He'll need to survey the placement first. That takes time. 2 hours, maybe 3. And Martha? She was here at dawn." Eva paused. "Jesse, there's something else." He waited. She told him about the child. Word had come with Martha that morning, delivered quietly at the kitchen door while Jesse was still watching the road. A settler family named Howell, living 3 miles east on the flats, had a boy of 6 who'd been feverish since the previous day. The family's well had gone bitter. 2 weeks ago, the same week, Hollister's men had been working the east approach to the spring and tramping through the watershed. The boy had been drinking the well water. His temperature had been climbing since midnight. The town doctor, Pryor, had been sent for. He'd sent back a message that the roads were impassable after the recent rains, which Eva and Jesse both knew was a lie because they'd ridden those roads themselves 3 days ago. Pryor had also sent back the information that he didn't make calls to waste station country. Jesse's jaw went tight when she said that. Pryor's on Hollister's list, apparently. She looked at him steadily. "Martha wants to go to the Howell family. She can help the boy. Hollister's men are on that road. I know, she knows. She's going anyway." Jesse was quiet a moment. Then he set down the cartridges and picked up his rifle and his hat. "I'll get her there. You're needed here. 20 minutes out, 20 minutes back. Alcott's men can hold the road approach until I return." He looked at her. "A child is sick, Eva." She didn't argue. She knew better by now than to argue with Jesse Vance about something he'd already decided was the right thing to do. He rode out with Martha at sunup, cutting the back trail through the scrub to avoid Hollister's main approach. Ben Alcott arrived with 4 men 20 minutes later, coming in from the South Ridge, and Eva met them at the gate with coffee and the current count of Hollister's positions. Jesse was back within the hour. By mid-morning, the Alliance was assembled in the station yard. 11 men total, Alcott's homesteaders, and 3 Diné riders from the Sozi family, standing on the same ground and looking at each other with the careful, measuring expressions of people who had more history between them than they'd discussed. Eva watched them sort it out. In the way people do in a crisis, not through speeches or declarations, but through the practical business of sharing information and deciding who knew what about the terrain. Nayeli Sozi, the 16-year-old she'd been trusting with her coded letters, turned out to know Oak Haven Springs approach angles better than anyone alive, except possibly Jesse. He was 15 minutes into explaining the canyon positioning before Alcott's oldest hand was deferring to him on questions of sightline. Eva noticed that. She thought Alcott noticed it too. Martha returned at noon. She came into the station kitchen and set her leather bag on the table. Her face was composed. She began laying out the contents of the bag with the unhurried focus of a woman who trusted her knowledge and didn't need an audience for it. She'd brought sage dried and bound in tight bundles, 2 clay jars of something that smelled like pine bark, and something else, sharper, that Eva couldn't name. A rolled piece of cloth that turned out to contain a dozen separate smaller packets, each labeled in careful writing. She worked for 2 hours. She brewed a specific tea from 3 of the packets, measured by smell and pinch rather than by any written formula, heated it to a precise temperature she tested by touch, added 2 drops of something from the clay jar, and sent it back with one of the Diné riders to the Howell family with careful verbal instructions that were more precise than most written prescriptions Eva had seen. 2 of Alcott's men watched from the doorway. She didn't acknowledge them. Late in the afternoon, a rider came back with word from the Howell family. The boy's fever had broken. He'd kept the tea down. He was sleeping. The rider was one of Alcott's own men who'd gone with the medicine. He stood in the kitchen doorway and delivered the news, and then looked at Martha for a moment with an expression that had gone through several things in quick succession and had landed somewhere around plain respect. He took off his hat. "Ma'am," he said. Martha glanced at him. "He will need more tea in the morning. Same measure. I'll send it." The man nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He put his hat back on and went back out to the yard. Eva had been watching from the corner of the kitchen. She stepped to the porch where Alcott and two of his men were standing, looking out at the spring road where Hollister's survey team had been visible all afternoon. She spoke to all three of them, but she spoke loud enough that the yard could hear. "Water flowing through the dirt doesn't ask if you're white or DNA," she said. "Neither does fever." She paused. "We are only equal when we learn to respect each other's basic humanity above the color of our skin." Alcott looked at her. He was a big, deliberate man, slow to conclusions, the kind of slow that means thorough rather than simple. He looked at the Sozi riders in the yard. He looked back at Eva. "Been running this land next to Dene families for 11 years, he said. "High time we acted like it." He crossed the yard and put his hand out to Nayeli Sozi. After one beat, Nayeli shook it. The alliance held. Jesse, standing at the edge of the yard, watched all of it without saying a word. He caught Eva's eye across the yard and held it for one moment. Then he turned and started positioning men for what was coming in the morning. The magic hour light was something the desert saved for special occasions. Just before sunset, when the sun hit the sandstone mesas at exactly the right angle, the whole landscape turned colors that didn't exist anywhere else on Earth. Deep crimson, burnt amber, a gold so saturated it looked like the rocks were lit from inside. The kind of beauty that didn't care what was happening underneath it. Gunsmoke was curling through it. The firefight had started at mid-afternoon, and it was still going when the magic hour found them. Smoke rising lazy through that extraordinary light, the crack of rifles echoing off the canyon walls, and returning from 3 directions at once, so you could never quite be sure where the sound was coming from. Hollister had moved on the spring at noon with his full force. 14 riders and the blasting crew, the survey complete and the placement marked. He'd been so focused on the spring approach that he'd underestimated the ridge. Nayeli had put 4 riders up on the east ridge before dawn. Alcott's men held the south approach and the station road. Jesse had positioned himself in the rocks above the spring itself, high on the west face, where the sandstone broke into a series of natural shelves and overhangs that gave him angles on the entire spring basin. When Hollister's blasting crew moved to set the first charge, Jesse's shot took the charge out of the man's hand from 240 yards. That was how it started. The firefight spread fast. Hollister's mercenaries were professional, and they recovered quickly, splitting into 2 groups, one pinning the ridge, one pushing hard toward the spring under cover of the wagon. They moved well. Eva, watching from the station porch with Jesse's spare rifle in her hands, gave them that. They were better than ordinary hired men. But they didn't know the ground. Nayeli's riders did. Alcott's hands did. Jesse most of all. The first hour belonged to Hollister's numbers. They pushed the ridge riders back and got a man with the blasting equipment moving toward the spring, under heavy cover, crawling flat in the red dirt with the charge strapped to his back. Eva tracked him from the porch. She watched him get within 30 yards of the spring. Jesse saw it too. She heard his shot from the west face, saw the mercenary scramble back, the charge abandoned in the scrub. But the second man was already moving, and then a sniper found Jesse's position. She didn't know that from any single thing. She knew it from the change in the rifle pattern, from the west face, the longer pauses between Jesse's shots, the movement that said he was pinned down rather than choosing his moments. The sniper was on the east rim, above and behind Jesse's position, a clean angle that Jesse couldn't answer without exposing himself. Eva moved off the porch. She didn't announce it. She went through the station kitchen and out the back and into the pine grove at a low run, cutting around to the storeroom where Hollister's men had left a cache of their own equipment when they'd used the station as a staging point. She'd inventoried that cache the day after the house arrest ended, the way she inventoried everything. She knew exactly what was there. 2 crates of Hollister's blasting powder, the secondary store he'd left behind when the main supply went to the wagons. The East Rim sniper was positioned above a long shelf of rock that extended out over the canyon. She couldn't see the shelf from the ground. She knew where it was from Nayeli's description of the ridge positions, committed to memory 3 nights ago in the kitchen, over a hand-drawn map. She packed the smallest viable charge. She'd watched the blasting crew work all day yesterday through the kitchen window. She was not an engineer. She was a woman who paid very close attention to things and had a good memory for details. She moved east through the scrub on the low ground, below the sight lines of the firefight, taking the long way around. It took 15 minutes. Her heart was loud the entire time. She kept moving. The shelf of rock was where Nayeli had said. The natural crack in the base of it was where the geological logic said it would be, running along the fault line she'd been able to trace from the map. She set the charge low in the crack. She did it with steady hands. She lit it with the match she'd carried in the oilskin in her pocket and moved back hard and fast behind the largest rock she could find. The explosion was smaller than she expected in terms of noise. The rock slide was larger than she expected in terms of everything else. A full section of the shelf gave way, cascading down the east face in a roar of fractured sandstone that sent dust boiling up above the rim like a signal fire. The sniper's position disappeared into it. She didn't know if the man was hit. She knew his angle on Jesse was gone. From the west face, Jesse's rifle opened up again. Steady, measured, decisive, no more long pauses. He was moving now, working down the rock, and she heard it shift in the firefight below. Hollister's men pulling back from the spring, the forward pressure breaking. Hollister himself had been back by the wagons the entire fight. She'd tracked him from the porch. She knew where he was. Jesse apparently knew, too. He came off the west face and moved through the scrub toward the wagon position with a directness that made the 3 mercenaries between him and Hollister reconsider their options rapidly. 2 pulled back. 1 didn't. Jesse went through him, a brief, brutal exchange in the red dust, and came out the other side moving the same way he'd been moving. Hollister ran. Not far. The terrain didn't give him far. He made the rocks at the north end of the spring basin and turned with a pistol in his hand. And Jesse came around the sandstone pillar from the east, and they were 20 feet apart. In the last gold light of the magic hour, both of them breathing hard, gun smoke in the air between them. She couldn't hear what was said. She was still east of the spring. She saw Hollister's pistol come up. She saw Jesse's already level. Hollister's pistol dropped. He sat down on the rock behind him with his hands up and his face gone the color of old ash. The fight was already over by the time she reached the spring basin. Alcott's men were moving through the remaining mercenaries, collecting weapons, collecting the men who hadn't ridden out when the rock slide changed the arithmetic. The Tsozi riders were at the spring, pulling the survey stakes out of the ground one by one and dropping them in the dirt. Jesse was standing over Hollister when she arrived. His rifle was lowered. He wasn't touching him. She reached into her coat. She pulled out the second ledger. Not Orson's, Hollister's. The one she'd found in the locked saddlebag on Hollister's horse. The horse he'd left at the station gate during the house arrest. The horse she'd had 11 days to search while Cutter wasn't looking. She'd been carrying it since the fight started. She held it up so Hollister could see it clearly. His face did something complicated and final. Territorial marshals, Jesse said, loud enough for the yard. Real ones, not Pryor's borrowed badge. There's a circuit court marshal out of Tucson named Riordan who is not on any of these lists. He glanced at Eva. She was already opening the ledger to the page she'd had marked for 3 days. Names, dates, dollar amounts. Every bribe, every arrangement, every deputy and judge and land clerk who'd taken Hollister's money and looked the other way. "I'll write the letter," she said. She did it at the kitchen table that night, by lamplight, with Jesse at the door and Alcott's men camped in the yard, and the spring running, clean and undisturbed, outside in the dark. She wrote it carefully and completely, citing page numbers and entry dates, and cross-referencing Orson's original ledgers against Hollister's own records. She wrote until her hand ached. Then she sealed it and addressed it to Marshal Riordan in Tucson and gave it to Nayeli, who rode before dawn. The territorial marshals arrived within the week. 6 months later, the schoolhouse had a proper door. It hadn't started that way. It had started as 3 walls and a canvas roof that let the rain in, built in 8 days by Alcott's men and the Tsozi family working together on the north side of the station, where the morning light came in from the east and the pine grove blocked the worst of the afternoon heat. The 4th wall came from a homesteader named Garrett, who showed up with lumber and no explanation beyond the fact that his daughter was going to attend, and she deserved walls on all 4 sides. The door came from Jesse. He'd spent 3 evenings in the back of the station working on it. Juniper wood, fitted and planed smooth, with a simple iron latch he'd had made in town. He hung it on a Saturday morning, while Eva was teaching inside, and she didn't notice until the draft stopped, and she looked up to find a proper door where canvas had been. She'd looked at him through the new doorway for a moment. He'd shrugged and gone back to the yard. The schoolhouse held 14 students by the 2nd month, 9 white children from the surrounding homesteads, and 5 DNA children from the Ridge families, ages 6 through 13, sitting on benches that Nayeli had helped build, learning to read from the books Eva had ordered from a catalog in Tucson and paid for out of the station's reviving accounts. Eva taught reading, writing, and arithmetic in the mornings. She kept it practical, grounding the arithmetic in real problems, measuring water flow, calculating planting cycles, understanding land deed language. She wanted these children to be able to read a contract and know when they were being cheated. She wanted them to be able to write their own letters and file their own claims. "Knowledge," she told them on the first day, "is the one thing a man cannot take out of your hands once it is in your head." Martha taught in the afternoons. She came 3 days a week, and she taught the things she knew. How to read the land for water, which plants cleaned a wound and which plants cleaned a water source, how the desert managed heat and cold, and why adobe held temperature the way stone couldn't, how to find direction from the stars, how to identify the plants that indicated underground water. White children and DNA children sat side by side learning to read the land in the same language. Eva watched from the doorway one afternoon and felt it. This thing Orson had been doing quietly for years, become something visible, become something that would outlast all of them. The deed had come back in early spring. The territorial court, presented with Hollister's ledger, and Eva's documentation of Orson's prior water rights claim, had ruled in her favor within 60 days. Oak Haven Spring was legally designated a public water trust, managed by the station, accessible to all parties in the territory without restriction or fee. Hollister was in a territorial jail in Tucson awaiting trial on 11 counts, including bribery of public officials, fraudulent land seizure, and conspiracy. The circuit judge handling his case was, specifically, not on his ledger. Eva had checked. The station itself had grown. 2 new rooms added to the main building, one serving as a proper medical space for Martha's visits, one as a small post office that the territory had finally consented to recognize after Eva wrote them 4 letters, each more precise and persistent than the last. Stage service had resumed. 2 new supply routes had been established, one running north to the Dine settlements, one east to the growing cluster of homesteads. It wasn't a town yet. It was becoming one. The ceremony happened on a Thursday evening in late autumn, when the desert had gone cool and clear, and the sky above whispering pines was the kind of dark that showed every star Arizona possessed. There was no preacher. Eva had thought about a preacher and decided against it. What she and Jesse were exchanging wasn't a legal claim on each other. She had no interest in being anyone's legal claim again, and Jesse had less interest in the paperwork of possession than any man she'd ever met. They did it at the spring, small gathering, Martha Nayeli and his family, Alcott and his wife, a quiet woman named Ruth who'd brought a pie and didn't feel the need to make speeches about it, Mrs. Delacroix, two of the Howell family who'd come the long way around the mesa specifically. Jesse had carved the rings himself. Juniper wood, sanded to a finish that was smooth and pale and smelled faintly like the grove behind the station. He'd worked on them for 3 weeks, she found out later, starting over twice to get the sizing right. She'd made her dress from fabric. She ordered special, a deep red-brown that matched the canyon walls at magic hour. She wore her hair loose, which she never did, because she'd decided to be exactly as she was, rather than what the occasion was supposed to require. Jesse cleaned up better than she would have predicted, given available evidence. He looked like himself, only pressed. He stood at the spring with his hat in his hands, and his jaw set with the same serious precision he gave to everything that mattered to him. They read their own words. She'd written hers. He'd committed his to memory, which she hadn't expected, and which got her, briefly, in the throat. He put the ring on her finger in the firelight. She put his on. The gathering was quiet and warm and unhurried. Someone had brought a fiddle. It came out after the food, and the music went up into the dark Arizona sky, and the desert took it somewhere. Later, standing on the porch together in the cool dark, Eva leaned against the rail and looked out at the spring, at the land, at the enormous spill of stars. Jesse was beside her, close enough that his arm was against hers, both of them looking out. "Not planning on riding away, lone cowboy," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she heard him turn to look at her. She felt his lips press against her forehead, warm and deliberate. Then he said it. The Dine have a saying. Love isn't a contract of ownership. It's two free people choosing to walk the same trail together. A pause. Every morning the sun rises. I'm going to keep choosing to walk it with you. She stood there and let the desert be large around them, and the spring run in the dark below, and the music drift out from the warm light of the station behind them. She'd left Missouri with a trunk and no plan, and more fear than she'd admitted to anyone. She'd walked into the frontier and found violence and loss, and a spring worth fighting for, and an old man worth mourning, and a group of people building something real out of the hard dirt of an unforgiving territory. She'd found Jesse Vance, who had looked at her brokenness without flinching and handed her a knife. The schoolhouse door creaked in the wind. Somewhere up on the ridge, a night bird called. The water at Oak Haven Spring ran over the rocks in the dark, the same way it had run for 1,000 years, belonging to no one, available to everyone. Eva Thorne put her hand over Jesse's on the porch rail. She looked up at the stars. She was exactly where she'd chosen to be. Eva Thorne arrived in Arizona territory with a trunk, a ledger, and a fear she couldn't name out loud. She left Missouri to escape a world that had spent her entire life telling her what she was worth, and the number was always someone else's to decide. She wasn't running toward anything. She was just running. Most of us know that feeling. We've all stood at some version of that canyon edge, not sure what's on the other side, only certain we couldn't stay where we were. What this story gave her, what it offers all of us, isn't a fairy tale. It's something quieter and more durable than that. It's the idea that dignity isn't something you inherit or purchase or receive from another person's permission. Orson said it plainly on the very first night, wrapping her blistered hands by lamplight. A person's dignity is measured by whether they have the grit to stand on their own 2 feet as a free human being. Not by where they came from, not by how they're dressed, not by whose name they carry, just by whether they choose to stand. Eva chose to stand, night after night, in a territory that gave her every reason to fold. That choice repeated, stubborn, quiet, is the real spine of this story. Then there's Jesse, a man who arrived carrying the full weight of his past mistakes, who never once pretended those mistakes didn't happen, and who didn't use his guilt as an excuse to stop trying. His past was real. The damage he'd done was real. But so was every water delivery in the dark. So was every night he sat at a cave out in the freezing rain so someone else could sleep safely. People are not just their worst chapter. Jesse Vance understood, maybe better than anyone in this story, that character is not what you were. It's what you keep choosing to be, one morning at a time. The knife matters. It matters more than anything else in 10 chapters of this story. Because when Eva asked that question, trembling, soaked, terrified, the one question her whole life had been building toward, Jesse didn't answer it with words first. He answered it with an action. He put a weapon in her hand and turned his back. He gave her power over the situation before she'd even asked for it. That is what respect for another person's bodily autonomy actually looks like. Not a speech, not a promise. A gesture that said, "This body belongs to you, and I will guard the door while you remember that." And Oak Haven Spring. That spring is not just water. It never was. It's the thing in every community that belongs to everyone, or it belongs to no one, the resource, the school, the common ground that people in power will always try to fence off and privatize, because shared things are harder to control. Hollister didn't just want the water. He wanted the leverage that comes from owning what other people need to survive. Eva and Jesse and Orson and Martha and Nayeli and Alcott all understood, each in their own way, that some things are worth fighting for. Not because they belong to you personally, but because they belong to everyone equally. That principle is as alive today as it was in 1878. Martha healing the Howell child while the town's paid doctor refused to come. That moment is small and enormous at the same time. It didn't require a speech or a confrontation or a dramatic gesture. It just required one woman to show up with her knowledge and her hands and do the work. And it changed something in the men who watched. Prejudice doesn't always get argued out of people. Sometimes it gets witnessed out of them. Sometimes you just have to let the truth of a thing stand in front of someone long enough that they run out of reasons to look away. The juniper wood rings at the end are not a compromise. They're a declaration. Two people choosing each other freely, without paperwork of ownership, without legal claim, without one person becoming the property of another, just two free people deciding to walk the same trail. That is what love looks like when it hasn't been corrupted into possession. Eva understood that distinction better than most, because she'd seen the other version up close. Jesse understood it because a DNA elder once told him the truth about land and people in the same breath, and he'd been thinking about it ever since. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, locations, events, and dialogue are entirely the product of the author's imagination and are used for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The historical setting, cultural references, and depictions of the American frontier are presented in a narrative context and are not intended as definitive historical record. The DNA cultural references included in this story are treated with respect and are not intended to appropriate, misrepresent, or speak on behalf of any indigenous community or tradition. Readers are encouraged to seek out authentic voices and scholarship for a deeper understanding of Native American